how to seize opportunities. Does it have anything to do with luck? When people explain how they get opportunities, oftentimes they just sound like afterthoughts. Is there a genuine way to spot and seize opportunities? Let's talk about it. Hi, welcome to the Art of Winning Practice podcast. I'm your host, Tristan. This is where I talk about how to apply the Art of War principles to get better results in business and everyday life. And today's topic is the second of the 5 fundamental elements of success in the Art of War: trends and opportunities. As we know, the success of a business is often heavily influenced, if not dictated, by the circumstances. Things like politics, economy, and the social, technological, legal, and other factors. It could be quite sophisticated. But when they do work together, the business could take great advantage of these factors and succeed with less effort. It's like the metaphor of a fish swimming downstream, moving without having to spend too much energy and still getting where it needs to go. And this general idea is what the Art of War considers as the second most fundamental element of success. It's a very simple idea, but the problem is it's never easy to apply. But there's the good news. As the Art of War emphasizes trends are important, it also provides some useful thoughts for finding them. In chapter 1:17, the book says, "Heaven signifies night and day, cold and heat, times and seasons." Yes, you heard it just right, heaven. It almost sounds like a riddle, but we don't have to crack it because I brought a story that shows us what it means. Let's go back to June 4th, 1944, 2 days before the Normandy landings. At exactly 4:15 a.m., the Supreme Commander, Dwight Eisenhower, called for a meeting. A group of Allied commanders gathered in the Southwick House in Hampshire, England. James Stagg, the Chief Meteorological Officer of Operation Overlord, was trying to persuade the commanders to postpone D-Day, the Normandy landings. This was a huge ask. Normandy landings took years to prepare. It was the biggest and the most expensive seaborne invasion in human history. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, tens of thousands of ships, vessels, and aircraft were already deployed in position, ready to go. But just before the time for action, James was urging the last-minute postpone. Why? Because he predicted that a storm was coming to Normandy and would make the landing impossible. Now we all know D-Day is June 6, 1944, but it was actually planned to start on June 5th, because June 5th was the first day of a 3-day window with the required astronomical conditions for the landings, especially the moon, the tide, and the time of sunrise. And here's why. Better moonlight would provide visibility for the aircraft to strike the defenses on the beach. Low tides were for exposing the underwater obstacles so that the ships could launch landing craft. And the late sunrise was to cover all the preparation work for the initial landings. So this 3-day window was extremely precious. It would only occur every lunar cycle, 28 days. And if they could compromise on the moonlight, it would still need half a lunar cycle to reoccur, so at least 2 weeks. But this coming storm James predicted would ruin everything. The cloud would block the moonlight, the wind and waves would prevent launching the landing craft, and even the troops could get to the beach. The storm would only favor the German because they were on the defending side. So the obvious thing to do was to wait for 2 weeks till the ideal conditions reoccurred. But to redeploy such a massive operation, there was the high risk to expose the plan. Then years of preparation would be for nothing. And the major purpose of D-Day was the surprise element. However, in this weather forecast report, there was something else. James shared his insight that the storm would break for a few hours on June 6, and it would be still good enough to make the landing possible. So he advised a second option, to move the operation to June 6. And this was a very unpopular option. What if the storm didn't break? It would turn the operation into a suicide mission, and there wouldn't be another chance to surprise the Germans anymore. You see, in 1944, satellites and computers didn't exist. Weather forecasting was not as scientific. During World War II, the Allies had to fly squadrons in the air to observe the clouds and winds with only basic tools for weather forecasting. And this insight James provided was based on the observation data provided by Squadron 518. There were long debates in this emergency meeting. The commanders didn't reach an agreement. Operation Overlord was put on hold. But at least they agreed to come back in the morning of June 5th to check the status again. In the evening of June 4th, the observation data came back, which once again proved that James was right. There would be a break of the storm on June 6th. So after a detailed discussion with the forecasters, Eisenhower went ahead with James' advice. Operational velour was set to begin at 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, and we all know the rest of the story. For many decades, there has been this argument that D-Day was a huge gamble. The commanders were gambling on the weather, but in the story, with all the facts and data on the record, it was very clear that D-Day was such a carefully calculated operation with every possible detail taken into account. It definitely has many risks, but instead of just calling it gambling, in my opinion, it is actually one of the best examples for everyone to learn how to truly identify and seize opportunities. Because the stakes were simply too high to gamble. In fact, there was even no room for mistakes. The forecasters from 518 Squadron spent 10 hours a day in the sky, mostly at night and in severe weather conditions, collecting data for months just to make sure that the weather forecasts for D-Day would be accurate. These brave weathermen saved D-Day. Now let's get back to the art of war. Heaven signifies night and day, cold and heat, times and seasons. With the ancient Chinese poetic writing style, I can only imagine how much struggle this translator had to go through when translating this part. The word heaven came from a Chinese character that could be the sky, the heaven, the time, the day, or the timing. In the art of war, this sentence is actually emphasizing to plan for the timing, it requires the understanding of the short-term trends, long-term trends, fluctuations, and regularities. Let's map the words. Night and day represent the short-term trends because it changes frequently, its cycle is short, and it comes and goes rather quickly. Cold and heat represent the long-term trends. Its original text refers to the winters and summers, which alter in longer cycles. Times are fluctuations, and seasons are the regularities. The timing of D-Day was the result of the deep analysis of all the trends, but more importantly, the understanding and the awareness of the fluctuations in the general patterns of weather and astronomical environments. It was never random, and the storm incident definitely made everything harder. But because of it, it even made a stronger point of the importance of understanding these factors. And there was also something else. This coming storm actually helped D-Day more than we think, which made this true opportunity even more significant. You see, Hitler always suspected that the Allies would invade either from Normandy or Calais. So these two locations are both normally heavily guarded. But because the Nazis also predicted there was a storm hitting Normandy and the strong wind would last for 2 weeks, most of the troops left their defenses to play war games. German Field Marshal, the famous Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, even got back home to celebrate his wife's birthday. The surprise effect was even amplified by this storm. In the art of war, opportunities are the missing pieces that the leaders are actively looking for to complete the master plan. They are not random events that seems to be useful, and they are never luck. So to seize an opportunity requires the understanding of the cycles and trends and calculating them into the action plan. Once the right conditions are met, you don't even have to think twice. This war story perfectly explained this art of war principle and the rationale behind it for spotting the opportunities. Business owners and entrepreneurs should do the same as these military commanders. Find and make great use of the patterns. However, a business is naturally driven by revenue and growth, and when business owners are distracted or pressed too hard by the numbers, they might not be able to stay as sensitive to this information. And here's a famous example in the business world that we can all learn something from. In January 2012, Kodak, the legendary company that once captured 80% of the global photography market, filed for bankruptcy and announced to stop making cameras. And the major reason was their massive defeat in the digital camera arena. Let's take a look. Kodak was founded in 1888. For over 100 years, Kodak had been providing the most popular cameras and films to the whole world. And this company had been the pioneer in the industry. They invented the digital camera in the 70s. They designed the first megapixel sensor in the 80s. And they produced the first DSLR in the 90s. This really sounds backward. They've been leading the technology game, but they lost the business competition all because of one reason. They rejected the opportunity. They missed the best timing to harvest the technology they invented. Their technical team was amazing. The scientists and engineers were pushing technology limits, but the management saw the innovation from a different perspective, and they just want to focus on the core business. And I believe this idea is commonly shared among business owners and entrepreneurs because it is the key responsibility of the leaders to focus on the core business. There's nothing wrong in itself. But when there is a disruptive challenge or innovative idea, the management mindset should be open to the changes. And this is where Kodak did wrong. Since the 80s, the Kodak Market Intelligence had been providing very extensive research, which looked at the core technologies and the possible adoption curves of digital photography. The study provided the outlook for not only just the technology itself, but also other downstream innovations in the ecosystem, like displays, computers, printers, and various other components. Reading the reports today, you will be amazed how remarkably accurate they are, both in short and long-term analysis. But the problem was the management focused too much on their core business. In 1996, when Kodak introduced their most advanced digital camera system, which cost $500 million to develop, the management team forced the system to use films and prints instead of producing digital copies because they need this new generation of products still take care of their core business. And during that time, inside Kodak, there were many conflicting opinions about where this digital technology would lead the business. And one thing was very clear. If Kodak started pushing this digital technology forward, it would definitely cannibalize their existing photochemical infrastructures and products. So what did the management do? In the whole decade of the 90s, Kodak hired 3 different CEOs. None of them did anything significant to commercialize digital photography technology. And on the contrary, they disregarded the technology and kept trying various ways to promote their films. In one interview with the New York Times, a new Kodak CEO summarized his observation of a Kodak in the 90s. He said, Kodak regarded digital photography as the enemy, an evil juggernaut that would kill the chemical-based film and paper business that fueled Kodak's sales and profits for decades. So the most critical 10-year window of the 90s was missed. Kodak's business completely collapsed in the early 2000s when films and paper sales came to a halt. In Normandy, Eisenhower listened. It didn't matter how many US officials disagreed with the UK forecasters on June 4th, 1944, because James and Squadron 518 did the good job. Thinking and acting with a holistic view are required for making any rational decisions. It cannot be done without open minds and trained eyes. The leaders can never have enough information to understand the circumstances. This factor of heaven in the art war is only the beginning. The fundamentals that remind us to learn the regularities and follow the patterns and trends. And further down the road in the artwork journey, this will be extremely critical to design a nimble organization, a responsive and agile leadership. Because if the leaders are stubborn and defensive, it will only be like many companies we remembered. Kodak, General Motors, Xerox, Blockbuster, Nokia, BlackBerry, Yahoo, MySpace, the list goes on and on. Once you get to these entry points of seizing genuine opportunities by observing and understanding trends, this fundamental logic would finally make sense of that saying, opportunities might not be obvious, but they're actually always there. Now, this is not me trying to be inspirational. This is the fact. This awareness and sensitivity of changes and patterns are powerful tools for not only just seizing opportunities, but also creating and developing opportunities, some skill everybody should learn. All right, thank you for listening. This has been the Artful in Practice podcast. I'm your host, Tristan. I'll see you next time.